back to In Search of Black Power. I am your host, Lawrence Grand Prix. So, it should come as no surprise, we are actually going to briefly go back to the 2024 election. Yes, we cannot quite get past it just yet, because in the aftermath of that election, I heard one of the hottest hot takes I'd heard in a while from popular leftist podcaster, YouTuber Kyle Kalinske. He's the husband of Crystal Ball, one of the co-hosts of Breaking Points, a popular independent news show on YouTube. And he basically made the argument that what Trump has that makes him scans authentic to so many voters and what they're looking for is someone who's charismatic and controversial and is able to connect to the populist anger in the country at the time. That the only hope, or the best hope the left has going forward, is to figure out which version of that they can harness for themselves to run in 2028, and who he landed upon at the time was Jon Stewart. The idea of Jon Stewart 2028 may be exciting to some liberals out there. It may make sense to mirror and copy the playbook that you lost to twice. But for those of us who are serious about political power and building political candidates who are actually accountable to the masses, the idea of someone like Jon Stewart and the idea of someone who talks about progressive policy needing to appeal to a celebrity like Jon Stewart, I think reflects the woeful state of the complete lack of political infrastructure and serious understanding around building power through institutions that the right did to create the context to, when Trump got in, push him towards tax cuts. When Trump got in, push him towards the types of policies that the right institutions had been marinating and cultivating through the courts, through the universities for decades before Trump. So, the reality is, the idea of focusing on someone like Jon Stewart reflects the type of activist shortcut that we've talked about a couple of times on these podcasts, and reflects the lack of political infrastructure that is actually talked about in the book of another popular figure on the online independent left, reporter and journalist Ryan Grim, in his book The Squad. Now, I read this book and thought it was interesting. I didn't think it was something we need to do a podcast on, but my co-host and partner here at Legions of a Beautiful Struggle, Davon Love, actually said, no, I think we should do a podcast on it. And he saw it as an important moment to reflect on this left that has been emergent and potentially insurgent really ever since Occupy. So since the financial collapse, we've had 15 years of this new millennial left in America. What do we have to show for it? What is the proof of its ability to do things in electoral politics? What is the dynamics about whether it can deliver on policy? And how do we, as folks who are approaching this from a perspective of wanting and needing material improvement for the conditions of people of African descent, how are we to understand the left? How are we to understand its relationship to us and its ability to be a vehicle for our progress? And the book, The Squad, is a pretty good place to actually interrogate that. So I'm actually providing questions to Davon, and he is providing his analysis of why he thought The Squad was worthy of an entire episode of In Search of Black Power. So that's what we have in store for you right now. So we thank you. We ask you to check out our partners and our media hosting colleagues at Black Liberation Media. So check them out on Patreon. Please continue to support them. Of course, in this media environment where leftist media is under attack, they have been demonetized but are attempting to continue to bring you shows like this through support on things like Patreon. And please continue to support us, Leads a Beautiful Struggle, at lbsbaltimore.com. And we thank you, and I will see you all on the other side. So reading Ryan Grim's book, The Squad, I learned a lot of things about AOC's first campaign that I did not know. I assumed that this group I'd heard about called Justice Democrats that was supposed to be this political infrastructure for the left had basically out-organized the Crowley campaign and really gone all in and defeated the machine. But it seems like it was just really haphazard. I think at some point they kind of abandoned her and she barely made it onto the ballot. And they said if Crowley would have challenged the signatures to put her on the ballot, they probably would have kicked her off. She would have never had won. And then when she gets some momentum without Justice Democrats, they kind of swarm back in, go all in, and kind of pull out this victory. In again, this district that had completely shifted demographically. He was living in D.C. It was the most random victory ever. But when that gets sold to you as a template for progressive change, it really makes you realize if that's the template, then we're really in a rough situation. So I just wanted to get your feelings about that and what it means for how we should think about politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think... let me start with, Ryan Grimm, who, is a very, well-respected journalist, progressive in his politics. And so, the importance of him writing the book is that his kind of close, behind-the-scenes, in-depth knowledge of the inner workings of, what is loosely described as a progressive movement. And so his commentary on it, I think, is especially important for those that are really trying to understand the shifting political landscape and what, in some ways, the expansion of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, like what that looks like and how that's unfolding. As you mentioned, one of the most important things that I think Grimm's book does is that it helps to understand in real concrete terms the fact that the progressive movement doesn't seem to have a general understanding of the importance of political machine building. So your description of AOC's campaign that Grimm documents in the book, he says that the Justice Democrats, their vision was to run a person in all 435 congressional primaries. And when they realized just how crazy that was, they started to hone in on a handful of campaigns, and AOC was one of the most prominent ones that they came in to focus on after having initially said they would focus on the entire country. So that's the kind of thing that tells me, like, if I was in the room and heard that, I would have said, oh, these people don't understand what it takes to build an institution. Because there's no way that there's the resources or time that is necessary to build a kind of machine that could be taken seriously in all those different congressional districts. And this, in many ways, I think, helps to provide some context as to the way that I think some progressives have now complained about some of the disappointments they have in AOC and other members of the squad. And not necessarily, and what I'm about to say isn't necessarily, apologizing for the commitments that those members of the squad or AOC made, that folks might make credible arguments that they have gone in the other direction. But what I want to say is that it is different when you are a person in a seat that has a political machine behind you. There are way more political options at your disposal when you have a functional political machine behind you. And so much of the conversation on the progressive left and progressive media has not been about political machine building. It's been speculating on what individual members of Congress could have done to have a bigger impact. And I just think that conversation has been, for the most part, a waste of time. Because the time spent talking about what individual Congress people or what a handful of Congress people could have done should be invested in what are the political machine, what is the infrastructure needed so that there is not only just more incentive for those members of Congress to do what the progressives want done, but what would then allow them to go on the offense, right? What are some of the things that will allow them to go on the offense and building an ecosystem that can combat the conservative wing of the Democratic Party? So I think Grimm's book does a great job of really explaining, for lack of a better word, like how ragtag the left and progressive political infrastructure is. And I actually believe that his description applies even to elements of the black left, right? And some of the folks that we, Lawrence and I are, comrades with, where I would say that can extend there where there is not enough conversation about political machine building. And I think a part of what Grimm gets at, and now these are my words, not his, is that it lends itself to a level of political immaturity, right? Particularly on the part of progressives, right? That idealism and ideological commitment is like the primary thing that folks are looking for when they're looking for people to represent them. And I think that what this book, I think, again, does a great job of is demonstrating not just the limitations of what AOC or others could do, but the limitation of like what impact you can actually have if you don't have the sufficient political machine. I watched the conversation. It was Breonna Joy Gray and Chris Hedges. And what I thought was really good about this particular conversation, I believe it was on Breonna Joy Gray's podcast, Bad Faith, her basically kind of doing what I'm saying, which is kind of in some ways complaining about the deficiencies of the squad and, you know, AOC and folks. And one of the things Chris Hedges said is like, they're politicians, right? They don't have a independent movement behind them that has the machinery to flex its muscle. And he gave examples of when progressives that have stood out there have been destroyed by the establishment. And the destruction that the establishment can do of people who take those positions, that is not something that is given enough conversation. You know, I think there are ways that like media and popular culture can dramatize, you know, what it looks like when people are threatened, you know, who take certain positions. You know, as you know, a quote I use all the time, this Hubert Henry Harrison quote, right, where we talk about the difference between chattel slavery and wage slavery. Chattel slavery enforced by brute force, wage slavery by starvation. That the same people that own the economy before chattel slavery own it still, and their primary mechanism of control is through starvation. So there's a way that they're able to impact people's ability to live, whether it's literally their ability to make money, whether it's the ability to put out narratives that would destroy their employment opportunities or that would denigrate them socially. I mean, there are things that the establishment is able to do to individual people that if you don't have a machine, in many ways, it doesn't make sense to expect an individual member or a handful of members of Congress to fight this large machine without sufficient political machine building.
Yeah. I remember I went to Black Lives Matter Lobby Day, and we were going to visit Donna Edwards. And I just remember her office being like behind Guam, behind American Samoa,
Right.
and just she had made some relatively minor criticism of Israel. And not only did they put her all the way in the back, she lost, and she's had a hard time being a thing since then. And I think one thing I'm realizing with the left is it's become very personal to many of them, but also celebrity is part of their strategy, their theory of change. Because if you become a celebrity, you can actually raise the money to actually fight to keep your seat. But that is not a political machine. Like, look what happened with Nina Turner. Everyone thought Nina Turner was going to win that primary. AIPAC comes in, drops a couple million, and people go against her. And so I think the moral purity almost becomes a benefit because it helps you become a celebrity. But that moral purity obscures the reality of machine building and the complexities of who you have to engage with to actually build a machine. Can you talk more about what a machine actually looks like? 'Cause I think even saying political machine, that can be so abstract to people. They say, yeah, the Twitter army is the political machine. And what that moral purity framework does to obscure that machine building.
Yep. So I'll talk about the machine building and then talk about the moral purity piece. So in terms of the political machine building, so we talk about political machine building, you know, there's some aspects of it that are extremely mundane. So whether that is like literally having people whose day-to-day job is to literally oversee all the relevant operations of the progressive movement, right? So whether that is someone whose job it is every day to read the news, the major news publications, what are they saying about electeds? You know, doing things like on talk radio shows, like planting callers, right? So planning to have callers, planning to push back against dominant narratives. Or even things like when it comes to legislation, because a lot of people think elected officials come up with legislation. It's really major think tanks or public policy entities behind them. And so, you know, having, you know, public policy entities that can essentially write the legislation, right, that then elected officials go and campaign on, right? And there's some of that, but not nearly enough to combat the other side. Or even, things as it relates to, again, having oftentimes when you talk to people, if you've ever, been a part of a political campaign, you knock on doors, what you'll hear people say is, I only see these people every election cycle. So being able to have people on non-election cycles, be able to engage voters, be able to engage people in the community and to advance their agenda, having people whose job it is who are paid to do that, right? Having independent media capacity. So this is where when we think about the progressive movement, there is an emergence of a progressive media ecosystem. It's my observation, though, that media ecosystem is not deployed as a part of a political machine, right? But in fact is a place where they have discussions about, progressive issues. But I don't know that there's I don't know of very many independent media platforms whose specific job it is to be on the offense against the establishment and that are in lockstep with folks who are the political operatives on the side of progressives or those who consider themselves radical. So those are just a few examples of like what it means to have a political machine. And as you mentioned in Grimm's book, he really does lay out the fact that you had people working for free. You had people who were, like in terms of even their lifestyle, like many people who you couldn't actually really have a family, right, and work the way that a lot of these people were working. And so just the thinness of the institutional infrastructure, both to run the campaigns that were written about in the book and to sustain a larger movement, is something that we got to take more seriously. And again, it's mundane. It's like, it's not fun to talk about who's going to go through, the newspapers and go after certain institutions. Who's going to be the people that write the white papers that then go to the progressive caucuses of state legislature. Like those aren't the sexy things, but those are the things that we got to build. In terms of the moral purity piece, and this is actually something else that I thought Grimm's book did a great job of, which is that he focuses on the Sunrise Movement, and he talks about many of the conversations that happened within the organization and some of the turmoil within these organizations really impaired their ability to be a political and legislative force at the capacity they could have been. So, and some of that is fueled by, I think, this generation of folks that comes in to many of these advocacy organizations where the emphasis is on who is most intellectually or ideologically pure. And there's a way that people are looking for a kind of leftist one-upsmanship, where it's like, are you sufficiently radical on issues of racial politics? Are you sufficiently radical on issues of gender politics? And there are ways that people obsess about an individual person's kind of moral, ideological standing and focus on finding failings and browbeating people into being more of this kind of ideological purity. And so what ends up happening, and it also becomes very narcissistic, where then it becomes, my feelings are hurt or I feel excluded. And that becomes the primary basis for the conversation about whether or not justice is being done within the organization. And now this isn't to say that none of those things matter. People should feel safe at their job. People should feel good about it. And if you're interested in really doing work, it's not going to feel good all the time, right? There are going to be times when you got to do work that takes away from time that you want to use to enjoy yourself. You're going to be working in environments that don't feel good, right? And there's a way that folks in these progressive spaces want to imagine, even though they're limited resources, want to imagine that you can create this kind of utopian work environment in a very toxic, capital-starved environment that in many ways is unrealistic. And then so he documents the way in which conversations about people feeling uncomfortable, people feeling unsafe, that there are ways in which that became such a central part of the progressive movement. One such document that got highly circulated, and I've actually seen it, this Tema Okun white supremacy culture piece, which Grimm talks about a bunch. And I think it's a great example of, Tema Okun, I thought when I initially, so we worked on a project here in Baltimore, the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund, which invests in, it's a non-lapsing fund funded by government that provides resources to grassroots organizations that work with youth, with an emphasis on community-based Black-led organizations. So in the development of that, there were folks on the staff, people who I like people that I think are legit folks, who brought this essay to a few of our meetings to talk about white supremacy culture. And I assumed, based just on the name, that Tema Okun was a Black person. And so I never really, but I remember having issues with it. And then later on, finding out that it was a white woman who claims to have co-authored it with a Black person for whom, based on Grimm's book, he wasn't actually involved in the writing of the document. It was a person who she had worked with that presumably would have reviewed the document and co-signed it. So it was really her that produced it. And so that document, that essay, part of the problem with it is that it talks about racial justice and white supremacy culture from the vantage point of primarily focusing on individual people's wellness outside of the context of the political warfare that we're engaged in. And what I'm clear about is, as a person for whom my own political intellectual socialization is kind of radical Black and Pan-African nationalism, I'm always clear that as much as we want to make sure our people are good in the context that we work in, I'm clear about the larger war that we're engaged in against a system that dehumanizes people of African descent. So I remember it being strange to me, the nature of this essay and it talking about white supremacy culture, things like deadlines, right, as an example of white supremacy culture. And one of the things I thought to myself is, look, if you're at war, it's certain things that got to be done by a certain time, right? And so there's a way that the things that are identified as white supremacy culture are things that white folks, particularly liberal whites, have the luxury of seeing them and feeling them primarily as oppressive, as opposed to recognizing that, yeah, we need this thing done because we need this bill drafted by a certain time so that we can go into this and fight this battle. So it was clear to me that this person, whether they were Black or not, it was clear to me that this person was not drawing from the Black radical tradition. And one of the problems that I think progressives have is that they are, because many of these progressives that are non-Black, that don't know much about the Black radical tradition, they don't know better, right? So they don't know enough to be able to have read this essay and say, this actually isn't emerging from the Black radical tradition. Here are other documents. Here are other scholars that theorize about this a lot better. The progressives don't have that. So to me, Grimm writing about the impact of this white supremacy culture essay is a great example of how progressive iterations of anti-racism are actually just adaptations to a form of white culture that is narcissistic, individualistic, and really out of context of the condition that Black people are in.
Yeah, Grimm talks about there were organizations, including Sunrise, that were in the meetings to actually write legislation for the Green New Deal and Build Back Better that would have shifted, billions and billions of dollars and tons of carbon dioxide. And they were derailed in the Great Awakening of 2020 with these internal rifts over internal culture, whiteness, and literally couldn't be effective at a critical moment for negotiation of legislation that impacts the entire planet, because people were using things like Tema Okun to talk about the culture of the organization, including, white employees using this against Black bosses in some of these places to call them out for white supremacy culture. So it's interesting because you have this identity-inflected progressive left that's trying to be intersectional, but sometimes missing the mark. And then you have the criticisms of that in terms of it not engaging material culture, that often comes from a class-centered left that oftentimes views engagements in things like white supremacy culture as, we're all human, we're all exploited via class, this is divisive, So the value of Grimm's analysis is talking about the ways in which these analyses have been infiltrating left institutions and made them ineffective. But I think that's also a component of Grimm's analysis that maybe reflects more of that progressive criticism of any incorporation of identity politics and understanding of the culture of white supremacy in a way that kind of reflects some of the limitations of that version of the left.
So picking up from the Tema Okun piece and what I described, what I think is Grimm's correct analysis, as you described just now, that the focus on some of the internal culture of moral purity within the organizations impacted their ability to be effective. And so I think his analysis is correct in identifying that. Where I think his analysis is limited is that when you think about, as we've talked about, the Black radical tradition and some of the scholars and activists and advocates in that space that unfortunately many progressives know nothing about. And so there's a way that any Black person who uses the term racial justice can get mistaken for a person that has a rigorous understanding of Black freedom struggle. And this goes into a larger problem that, you and I talk about a lot, Lawrence, in terms of just the standard of rigor in general being low as it relates to when it comes to studying Black people. Like, Black people, there's so much scholarship and work that Black folks have done that gets ignored and marginalized because the racism of mainstream white institutions is such that it is their belief that if they don't know about it, it doesn't exist. In fact, it reminds me of a story, and you've heard me use this example from Nalawi Rooks' book, White Money, Black Power, where she talks about being at an English department at a school in the Midwest. She was making a proposal for two Black literature classes. One was, I think, Black women writers, and the other were, I think it was like writers in the Harlem Renaissance. And she said there was like this silence in the room. It was all white, English department except for her. Silence. And she said she overheard someone lean over to the chair and say it's amazing that she thinks that Black people have written enough that you can have two separate classes on Black literature. And to me, that is such a great anecdote that explains how white folks, even well-meaning ones, think about the work that Black people have produced. That from their perspective, Black people have not produced a level of rigorous scholarship unless they know about it and have co-signed it. And I believe that Ryan Grimm, in his analysis of racial justice within the progressive movement, falls into that. Because while, again, his analysis of the impact of the Okun essay on progressive movements, I think is accurate. I think a part of the challenge is that an analysis of Black radical, leftist, pan-Africanist perspectives and folks that have engaged some of these political arenas from that perspective are omitted from even discussion, right, in a lot of these contexts. And so in some ways, it constitutes a gap between the progressive movement and working class Black people, because it is the traditions that I'm describing that provide some familiarity to working class Black people in terms of some of the traditions that I'm describing. And in fact, one of the things that I noticed that, I looked up, like, how often, how many times would Black nationalism come up at all? And the only time Black nationalism came up was him describing Hakeem Jeffries' family, for whom I believe Leonard Jeffries is his uncle. Mm-hmm. And Leonard Jeffries became center of a controversy in New York, the multicultural curriculum in New York. Leonard Jeffries being a proponent of approaches to Black nationalism and African-centered scholarship he described, that Grimm describes as a part of kind of an anti-Semitic perspective that comes with certain brands of Black nationalism. Now, that's its own discussion. Like, I think there's a discussion to be had about the way that certain forms of black nationalism, what is projected onto them are notions of anti-Semitism. I think that there are ways that when we have talked about like white liberals and that Jewish people who in many respects are deemed to be generally more liberal, that in many respects, many of the black old heads that we respect, even though we may reject some of the rhetoric that they would use to describe it, they're talking in large about like white liberals who have participated in the denigration of black sovereignty and self-determination. And that in many respects, that is what they're referring to, which again, I think, demands more conversation. But in the context of this book, in the context of the conversation about identity politics, we're critical of conservative or neoliberal uses of identity politics. Like we are critical of that, and we're on the record of being extremely critical of that in much of our own political work. What ends up happening, it is my belief that Grimm, in terms of his analysis in this book, and the larger progressive movement reduces the use of identity in politics to the neoliberal critiques. And what is off the table are the materialist critiques that come out of the black radical tradition that deal directly with political economy. And so in some ways, the progressive movement is guilty of rendering the tradition that we emerge from and lumping it with the kind of neoliberal, black neoliberal approaches to politics, lumping them all together when there is historic tension between those two approaches to politics that I think the progressives ignore. I think one parallel that I actually want to draw is, we're watchers of black liberation media. Jared Ball and Todd Burrows were having a discussion referencing an interview that Jared Ball did of Norman Finkelstein, of a book that Norman Finkelstein wrote, which I believe is I'll Burn Those Bridges When I Get There. And this was Norman Finkelstein, who is I think one of the most important scholars on the Palestine-Israel, in the last 50 years, like one of the most important consequential scholars on that question. And much of my thinking about the issue, borrows, largely from his work. So great respect for him. His book, though, We'll Burn Those Bridges When I Get to It, Jared, in his friendly and respectful pushback, he describes how his critique of Finkelstein's critique of Kendi, right? His critique of Robin DiAngelo, even some critiques of Ta-Nehisi Coates, that Finkelstein critiques those folks as if they are representative of the politics that we would bring into the space that is rooted in the black radical tradition, that is more materialist, that is less embraced by white liberals. And so I use that as a reference to say that Grimm, I think, falls into that trap in terms of his analysis, because he goes on to talk about the way that identity is bludgeoned against the progressive movements. And one of the things that Finkelstein even says in his conversation with Jared Ball is to say that Bernie Sanders emerges in 2016 with a class-based movement, rivals Clinton because it was supposed to be a coronation for Clinton, and then reparations emerges as something the Democratic Party embraces, and he describes it in many ways as a response to the class-based politics of Bernie Sanders. And I actually think it's way more complex than that. And one, I think to not give credit to the black people that have been pushing reparations for all these years as the reason to force the Democrats to take it seriously, I think is problematic. But I also think that when using that analysis, it assumes, or what it does is that it frames out all of us who were both, like, if Bernie Sanders is going to be on a primary, I'm going to vote for Bernie Sanders if I'm voting in a Democratic primary over Hillary Clinton 100 times out of 100. What it does, though, is that it renders invisible those of us who were both critical of the progressive movement on its lack of depth on issues of race and white supremacy, who are also clear that Hillary Clinton was worse than Bernie Sanders. So it essentially renders all of us invisible. And then what it does is that then it makes it so that having a more sophisticated analysis that both takes into consideration the limitations of a Bernie Sanders style progressive movement in terms of its deficiencies as it relates to dealing with issues of racism and white supremacy, while simultaneously recognizing that the corporate wing's use of identity is in fact a response to a more threatening politics than the status quo, is something that, again, is a limitation of Ryan Grimm. And I think that that limitation robs the progressive movement of an opportunity to build a base beyond its current base. Because I think if we're honest, much of the progressive movement is amongst progressive whites and some of the black people and non-white folks who are in those networks. But it's a missed opportunity because, again, I think there are elements of the black left or elements that of the black radical tradition that align with much of the agenda of the progressive movement. But Grimm's narrative of identity politics in this book, I think, foreclose a possibility of a more sophisticated analysis, and in some ways foreclose the kinds of coalitions that would be needed to actually push the agenda that I think there's some mutual overlap with between us and some of the folks in the progressive movement.
That's a lot, but I think it's very important because I realized reading this book that Hillary Clinton saying breaking up the big banks would not end racism is almost like the super villain origin story of this version of the left. Mm-hmm. They took that as so offensive that they can't imagine that there are forces that have legitimate criticisms of the left that are not just bad faith, mm-hmm. right? And so I think that it's important to think about, because when you say there are ways in which there's a more effective politics, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because what I imagine a lot of these folks would be saying is that they imagine the folks on the ground who are trying to benefit from the redistribution that comes from the Democratic Party are probably more ideological than they actually are. Mm. In terms of because I think about Sanders in South Carolina and going with Biden in South Carolina. People were ideologically committed to the Biden project. It's like, no, they just knew that they could have leverage over Biden in the way they couldn't over Bernie. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason they don't have leverage over Bernie is because you're not engaging with them. Mm-hmm. You're not tying your machine to them. You're not giving them legitimate concessions because they want things like investments in community-controlled organizations. But things like that would challenge your notion of class-based redistribution as the only solution. And in fact, when they say things like the white folks are getting all the money that's supposed to go to black schools, the left would say that sounds like anti-Semitism, rather than actually hearing a political economy critique about the distribution of resources on something like that. So I think that's one example. Can you think of other examples because these folks can't imagine how this would actually be more effective, because all they hear is people who want to destroy the stuff they think is effective.
So a few things with that. The first is that one of the things that I think we got to be honest about is that there are social networks that often don't overlap. So I'm going to go back to your example of Clyburn in South Carolina. That black people, and I think people in general, but black people in particular, have had people make promises before. Right, all kinds of people that'll say, you vote for me or you support my thing and this is going to improve your life. And so many times folks have made those promises and not delivered. So there's a way that particularly working class black people relate to folks coming and saying, this is our agenda, this agenda will be good for you. There's a way that people stop trusting what you say and they trust what they think you can deliver on. And that is a level of political astuteness that I think that the progressive left misunderstands. I think they misunderstand it as backwardness or not being educated voters or in some cases being shills of the Democratic Party. And while some of that may be the case, I think the majority of it is folks being astute. So it reminds me, and we've talked about this before, it reminds me of there's a podcast, This is Revolution, Pascal Robert, he describes it as the fat back and biscuits, wing of the Democratic Party. describing people like Clyburn. And and he's black, right? So, Pascal Robert is black and I think an intelligent person that gives good commentary. On that particular piece, though, I think that's incomplete. Because I would say that, I think it's true. Clyburn is a corporate Democrat. Clyburn is someone who's received unprecedented investments from Big Pharma, right? So Clyburn is a corporate Democrat. That his ability to appeal to black folks, though, in South Carolina, is largely his ability to deliver some real material benefits. Even though many of those people may recognize a need for a larger societal overhaul, right? Clyburn has been able, over years, to get rec centers in certain communities, right? Or get certain people jobs, or get certain folks, major contracts, or get certain schools, federal funding, or certain initiatives, earmarks. So he's established a track record where if I'm a constituent and this person has delivered for me, and what they say to me is, Bernie Sanders stuff sounds good, he's not going to be able to deliver, but Biden is going to be able to deliver. You've experienced me as being able to deliver on these things, right? Then that is a persuasive argument. And one of the places where I think progressives fall short is this question of, well, what are some of the concrete examples where progressives have been able to deliver? And this is something that I think progressives have some insecurity about. Because my experience of working with folks who consider themselves progressive, one of the places where they are not solid on is how to operationalize the policies that they advocate for. So they normally stop at just what the policy does. So economic redistribution, just give it to social programs. But if you stop there, and this goes to the point that you made around like the nonprofit industrial complex, a part of, I think, the wide base that LBS has been our critique of the nonprofit sector, because so many black people either experience subpar service from those industries that are supposed to be tasked with helping us, or professionals in that sphere who are black that are marginalized by white people who preside over those institutions, whether it's health and wellness, out of school time, reentry, juvenile justice, that white people run many of these major entities that impact black people the most, or other folks of color. And so progressives tend to not be good at being able to talk about how to take the idea or the policy and how it actually delivers and delivers in a way that takes in consideration some of the particular dynamics that black folks are engaged in, right? That black folks are dealing with. So again, it's like the fat back and biscuits caricature, I think, doesn't it lets progressives off the hook, because then they don't have to think about, okay, well, what is actually our approach to being effective? And in some ways, this takes us back to the beginning when we talk about, I think what was good about Ryan Grimm's book in terms of analyzing the frayed infrastructure of the political machinery of progressives. If you're not prioritizing the political machinery, that tells me, or at least signals to me, that you're not serious about actually implementing and putting into practice, being able to deliver on the things that you're promising. So I think that's one part of that. And then I think in terms of, again, talking about Bernie Sanders and this class-based politics, going back to the classic kind of race-class, division in the left, that for us is, the obvious answer is both. But the question is, how is both manifested? And I think when we talk about redistributive policies, it is that those of us that are critical of what we would say are blind spots in a Bernie Sanders, progressive movement, that those deficiencies, I don't see progressives really engaging the critiques that folks like us make. And to your point, it's easy to look at Hillary Clinton breaking up the banks and racism. It's easy because those of us that are serious about the work, we know that was bullshit. You know what I'm saying? People who are serious weren't tricked by Hillary Clinton, right? Weren't tricked by the neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party. And those of us that are serious, like Kendi is like basic to us. You know what I'm saying? Like Kendi doesn't represent a serious analysis of addressing the material conditions of the masses of black people, right? So those of us that are serious, we're clear about that. What that the impact of that, or something that I think is important for progressives to know, is that there is a black world that operates outside of the world that they're familiar with, and that world is probably scary to them. Scary to them in a variety of ways, but one of the ways, and for the purpose of this conversation, scary to them because there are certain kinds of benefits that come to a certain section of the white community that benefits off of social programs and investments in healthcare and public health, that there's certain folks who would lose their dominance if they had to engage the black world that we're talking about. And many of them don't want to be honest about that. I remember there's a major foundation in the region when the uprising happened in 2015, when Freddie Gray was killed by police. There's a foundation locally for whom, when I talked to people that were in the foundation, were saying that there was these calls for racial justice, for black people to have more control of the resources. And there were mostly white women who said, well, what about my job? And there are people for whom their livelihood is based off of these industries, that if you had to give them to black people, they lose out. So I think that's one of the places where the progressive movement just isn't honest about talking about some of the anxieties and the implications of what it would mean to engage the black world that we're describing.
Yeah, increasingly I think the divide is not so much left-right, it's top-bottom. And Bernie Sanders' politics is essentially a top-down progressive redistribution of resources. But people experience the current constellation of things they can touch, community development corporations, as something that is more bottom-up. And they've not experienced success of that from people that call themselves the left. Because one thing I realized is they don't know how to manufacture an AOC except celebrity. But we can manufacture a Jill Carter, and we can manufacture a Perrin Mitchell, and people have experienced that. So folks like Perrin Mitchell, did the minority set-aside, something they call black capitalism, but it redistributed resources to get jobs for black men without college degrees, that kept a lot of them off the streets, and was experienced very effectively by a person who called himself a socialist, who was against the Vietnam War, as a way to get some money for his base to be able to fund him to keep that seat. So when you don't take infrastructure seriously, someone like Perrin becomes someone you don't know anything about. Mm-hmm. Or becomes a black capitalist you can just ignore. Mm-hmm. While people experience that, and it's like, oh, well, that's something that I can see benefiting me. How do I get a version of that? So they look at something like ARPA, which I've seen leftists call the biggest upward redistribution of wealth in history. Well, everything the government does is the upward redistribution of wealth. But ARPA came with local control of dollars that went directly to cities that mirrored some of the best of the model cities programming, of the poverty programs of the 70s. Mm-hmm. And people experienced that as investing in violence prevention programs that kept people alive. So if you can just dismiss all of that and call that fat back and biscuits, people experience that as you're not actually caring about the things that actually really touch their lives. And again, you can do local politics to make people experience you differently. But when your theory of change is so top down and so federally focused, because who was Bernie going to staff on these committees? Who was going to staff Bernie's foreign policy? All these questions that they'll ask themselves when they're more serious about their limitations, they can't imagine anyone, not them, would ever think anything like that to question them about, and are seriously considering their limitations based upon a legitimate, objective analysis of their lack of infrastructure and their lack of seriousness to think through the complexities of delivering for people that aren't in their base.
Yeah, and I think that, going back to Grimm's book, because one of the things he does document is AIPAC and some of the other affiliated entities, and they're targeting elected officials who took a stance against Israel and the genocide in Palestine. And what's interesting about that, when you think about Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, two black folks. Now, Cori Bush's district, I believe is majority black. I don't think Bowman's was majority black, but had a very substantive black and brown population. One of the things that I think is that Grimm, I think, correctly identifies is that much of the advertisements and the campaign against both of them were actually not about Israel, but in many respects, was critical of them being progressives, and that they were described in many ways as not being sufficiently supportive of the Democratic Party. Now, if we're having an analysis about politically, like what the progressive movement needs to do, and what would have helped Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, what would have helped them in places that have significant black populations is independent black electoral infrastructure that would have allowed them to stave off AIPAC, which has been able to invest in electoral infrastructure that allows them to be able to push those folks out of Congress. So they have that machinery that we talked about in the beginning. And so in many ways, the absence of a conversation about what is needed in those situations is particularly for the progressive movement, to invest in those independent black electoral infrastructure in those places that have substantive black populations. That is something that not including that, right, then makes it so that then the progressive movement is susceptible to the same political machine attacking folks on that basis. So in some ways, the Zionist movement recognized that. Like, they recognized the lack of political infrastructure, recognized the frailty of the progressive movement's infrastructure. But if you have local black independent infrastructure, it can outlive the particular moment and be more sustainable. So for me, again, the lack of engagement with the black radical tradition on Grimm's part contributes to, I think, what are important omissions that I think otherwise would have made, I think, the book more instructive beyond just the progressive movement and its audience. I want to put just a bow on the identity politics piece, because, again, I think that's such a big part of the conversations that are going to be being had, about the election, Trump becoming president, the Republicans having a decisive victory. And I think, we're at a crossroads where there's going to be a discussion about which approach the Democratic Party take in terms of whether to go right or to go left. And one of the things that I want to say, that in terms of the limitation I'm describing in terms of Ryan Grimm's analysis, is that it's not as simple as left or right. It is, are we going to go back to investing in the cities? And in part, when we talk about like investing in black people, right, in those major cities. And if the Democratic Party does not do that, then I don't think that there's a viable path for the Democrats to have victory. And to the extent they have victory, it won't be a victory that black people benefit from if they go in the opposite direction. And my concern is that the use of identity politics and framing it as if we're the same as the neoliberal identity politics will put us in a position where it'll be easier for the Democratic Party to focus more on those mostly white but multiracial suburban elites as opposed to going to black people.
Absolutely. I think the last thing I have on my mind is what was a key to understand Grimm's text is he calls Black Lives Matter a new name for an old movement. So he draws a historical continuity between the movements of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and BLM. And I think it's interesting because I don't do that. I look at the demographics of people that called themselves BLM and people who marched in 2020, and they were a very specific college-educated crowd that would be susceptible to like the reparations plan that's basically more money for nonprofits. While the marches of the 60s produced visions of black governance that did things like the community control of the model cities programs. And our reparations plan, which is about getting money to the ground to build up the muscles of local governance, is something that the left doesn't see that they could benefit from, because they assume if you say reparations, you're just an identity politics huckster. And also, they don't see it's possible because they don't see it's possible that the movements of the 60s led to a culture of black self-governance in cities. However much it has been responding to conditions of neoliberal capitalism, that is something that we value and that we see as an extension of an African cultural tradition of care for our community that we want reinvested in, as opposed to just destroyed by getting rid of the sellout politicians that the left sells us. We hope you've enjoyed that analysis of the book The Squad, the political left, black people's relationship to it, and what we can do going forward. So one thing you all can do going forward, and I need to get better about incorporating this into my conversation on the podcast, is we are dealing with a media environment through media algorithms and institutions and media channels that are not in favor of the work that we're doing, not in favor of the topics, not in favor of the tone, the lack of sensationalism. We do what we can to make it fun and engaging, but this is not Club Shay Shay. This is not even breaking points in terms of our scale and our access. So things you can do to help us continue to get the message out and break through is like and subscribe. Like and subscribe to Black Liberation Media. You can leave a review of the podcast on Apple Podcast or anywhere on your podcasting app that you can leave a review. All these things facilitate us going up in the algorithm. Another thing you can do is part of the idea of doing the podcast this way is, for all of its limitations, X is still a place where X is the new name for what used to be called Twitter. It is, of course, owned by Elon Musk, prominent Trump supporter. He probably needs a whole episode in and of himself, given that he's from South Africa. We'll save that for later. But we want to be able to engage in conversation with these folks, either online or on platforms where people who watch these shows and comment on these type of politics have conversations about these sort of things. So please feel free to tag us if you like the show or if you dislike the show. Please feel free to tag the people we talk about in this show and say, hey, there's this cool podcast that's making some points that maybe you should listen to. I think they have some interesting analysis. These are the sort of things that can get the attention of folks who have platforms, but also get the attention of folks in this burgeoning left YouTube ecosystem, which a lot of black people are in this ecosystem because with the exclusion of things like Black Liberation Media, we do not have our own ecosystem for these types of intense political conversations. So we want to bring folks that are in these ecosystems to us. We want to engage these ecosystems to the extent that they're willing to be challenged the way that our content does. Because we think we have something unique to bring, given that we're not media personalities. We're folks in the field doing work who have results to show for the things that we talk about. And for people who are interested in what works and what delivers, we really want to have these sort of conversations. We know, as we sort of talked about on many podcasts, that we continue to be under attack by folks like Sinclair Media, of course. David Smith, executive chairman of Sinclair, is a supporter of the Republican Party and told Trump in 2016, we are here to carry your message, and we continue to engage in this media warfare. So this is our attempt to not leave that media warfare space barren, not leave it only to our enemies, and not leave it only to sometimes well-meaning, sometimes even well-informed folks who lack the perspective and lack an understanding of the nuance and complexity and the history of the effectiveness of some of the things we bring to the table and the effectiveness of what we're doing here in Baltimore. So please continue to share the podcast. Please continue to share information about Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Please continue to go to our website, lbsbaltimore.com. Please feel free to sign up for our email listserv. That's the way we get around the algorithm to be able to get you the information you need to know what we're doing and how you can support us. And more importantly, support the things we're doing for community and support the political efforts we're making to improve community. So we thank you. We appreciate all of your support. We appreciate being back here in the booth for these podcasts and being sure we try to do them consistently as possible to give you the information you all need. And we look forward to continuing to walk in this journey, to continue to go in search of Black Power. I will see you soon.